I've been cheated on before. Twice, in fact, across 2 marriages and a few decades of doing what people do when they believe they are capable of genuine partnership. But this one broke something different. Not my heart exactly. Something quieter and harder to name. I came to Thailand because I had found something I genuinely thought was true. Not just a woman, but a way of understanding the world. And what I discovered on a Tuesday afternoon in Chiang Mai, through a phone call from a man named Frank who had been to Wat Suan Dok to photograph the white chetties, was that the thing I had built my last 3 years around had been quietly used against me the entire time. The temple visits, the merit-making, the candles and the incense and the particular quality of peace that I had believed she carried home on those mornings. All of it. I am 68 years old, and I am a retired schoolteacher from Portland, Oregon, and I was made a fool of by a woman who prayed beside me at a temple and then used that same temple as a place to meet someone else. I want to tell you how it happened, because the how matters, and because I think the specific shape of my particular foolishness might be useful to someone who is currently in a version of the same situation and does not yet know it. My name is Jasper Reynolds. I taught high school English literature for 31 years at a public school in the Beaverton district, retiring at 64 with a modest pension and a profound desire to be somewhere warm and quiet, where nobody needed me to explain the themes of the Great Gatsby for the 400th time. I had been interested in Buddhism for years before I moved to Thailand. Not the Hollywood version, not the fashionable wellness world version, but the actual practice, the sitting and the breathing and the slow, difficult work of trying to pay attention to what is actually happening rather than the story you are telling about it. I had practiced with a Theravada group in Portland for 6 years. I had read widely, sat retreats, learned enough Pali to follow a basic chant. When I retired, Thailand was not a whim. It was the place where the tradition I had been practicing in translation finally had a living context around it. Chiang Mai specifically, with its 300-plus temples and its monastic culture, and the way the city folds Buddhist practice into ordinary daily life so seamlessly that you stop thinking of it as a religious practice and start thinking of it as simply the texture of how people here move through time. I moved there in what I think was the autumn of 4 years ago, and I have not regretted the move itself, even now. I regret specific choices I made within it. The move itself was right. I met Thanya at the Sunday walking street market on Walai Road in the old city, which is where I spent most of my first few months in Chiang Mai, before I knew the city well enough to have specific places. She was selling handmade lacquerware from a small stall, trays and bowls and decorative boxes in the traditional Chiang Mai style, black and gold, with the careful, intricate line work that takes real skill to produce. I stopped because I was genuinely interested in the work, asked about the technique, and she explained it with the patient expertise of someone who has grown up watching it made and has been making it herself for years. She was 31 years old. She had grown up in San Kamphaeng, a district east of Chiang Mai known for its lacquerware tradition, and had moved to the city as a teenager and worked in various service jobs while continuing to make pieces on weekends. Her English was good, self-taught to a serviceable level through years of talking to the tourist visitors who passed through the market. We talked for 40 minutes about lacquerware and about the temple architecture visible from the market street, and about the particular quality of the Chiang Mai light in the evening, and I bought a small black tray with a gold lotus pattern that is still on my desk as I write this. I did not pursue her, at least not in any way I would have called pursuing at the time. I returned to the market the following Sunday because I genuinely liked the market, and she was there, and we talked again, and after the third Sunday, I gave her my line contact in the way you give someone your contact when you would genuinely like to keep talking to them, and you are not examining the precise nature of what you would like the conversation to become. She messaged me 2 days later to ask if I had been to a particular temple near the old city walls that she thought I would find interesting given what I had told her about my practice. I had not. We went together on a Saturday morning, both of us removing our shoes at the gate and sitting in the main hall for a while in the particular companionable quiet of two people who share a genuine reverence for a space. And that morning was, I think, when the friendship turned into something that was clearly going to become more than friendship. By the third month, we were in a relationship that both of us had named as such, gently and without drama. By the 6th month, I had moved from the guest house I had been staying in to a rented house in the Santitham neighborhood, north of the old city, and she had a key and stayed there most nights of the week. The arrangement felt natural and unhurried, which I valued. I was not a young man in a rush. I was 65 years old, and I had learned something from the previous 6 decades about the danger of rushing toward the shape of a life rather than waiting for the actual life to reveal its shape. I thought, genuinely, that this was something that was revealing its shape honestly. I thought she was exactly who she presented herself to be, a woman who made beautiful things with her hands and took her faith seriously, and was patient enough and interested enough in someone considerably older than herself to build something real. The Buddhist dimension of our relationship was not incidental. It was central. We went to temples together, Wat Chedi Luang in the old city, Wat Peara, that Doi Suthep up on the mountain with its view of the whole Chiang Mai basin spreading out below. Smaller neighborhood temples where she was known to the monks and where she would sit with a natural ease that I found both moving and instructive. She made merit regularly, the giving of food to monks on their morning alms rounds, the donation of offerings, the lighting of incense, and the pressing of hands together at the image of the Buddha, with a quality of genuine attention that I had no reason to question. She had grown up in this, it was as natural to her as breathing. And for me, the Farang who had come to this practice through books and sitting groups and a certain amount of intellectual scaffolding, being with someone for whom it was simply lived was a gift I did not take lightly. She deepened my practice, or so I believed. She gave me access to a version of the tradition that my reading could not have given me. She was my bridge between the conceptual and the actual. I also converted formally in the 2nd year. I took the 5 precepts at a temple in San Kampang, where one of the senior monks had known her family for decades. It was a modest ceremony, not unusual for a Western practitioner who wants to formalize their commitment, and it meant something significant to me. It also meant I recognize now that I had staked something of my identity, not just my emotional life but my sense of spiritual direction, on this woman and on this relationship. I was not only Jasper Reynolds, the retired teacher who had found love in Thailand. I was Jasper Reynolds, who had come to understand something true about impermanence and suffering and the possibility of genuine equanimity. And the person who had midwived that understanding was Thanya. You can see, I hope, what that meant for what happened when the understanding turned out to have been partially built on a lie. The changes began, as they always do in retrospect, before I registered them as changes. The first thing I noticed, perhaps 8 or 9 months into our second year together, so roughly 17 or 18 months in total, was that her temple visits became more frequent. She had always gone on Wan Phra, the Buddhist holy days that follow the lunar calendar, roughly once a week, but she began going on other days too, sometimes twice in a week, and coming home in the late afternoon with the particular quiet that I associated with genuine spiritual practice. I felt, when she returned from these additional visits, a specific and embarrassing gratitude, the gratitude of a man who is glad that his partner takes the thing he loves most seriously enough to give it extra time. I told myself this was beautiful. I never once asked which temple she was visiting. The second thing I noticed was that her phone, which had always been an unremarkable presence in our daily life, left on the kitchen table, carried in her bag without ceremony, began to occupy more of her physical attention. She started sleeping with it on her side of the bed, rather than on the charger across the room where it had always been. She started carrying it with her to the bathroom during evening hours. These are the classic signals, and I knew they were the classic signals, and I told myself that I was a man who had spent 30 years teaching young people to read between the lines of texts, and that I was therefore susceptible to seeing narrative where there was none, that I was pattern matching a cliché onto ordinary behavior, that I was being the kind of jealous, suspicious, ungenerous partner that my Buddhist practice was supposed to have moved me past. I told myself this, and I believed myself, and I resent that I was so convincing. In the third thing, the new perfume, there is a detail I have returned to many times. She had always worn a light jasmine fragrance, inexpensive, something she bought at the local market, and I associated it so completely with her that it had become in my mind simply what she smelled like. The way people who are with us long enough become indistinguishable from their particular sensory signature. One afternoon in, I want to say November, though it might have been December, she came home from a temple visit smelling of something different. Not strongly different, not dramatically, just a slightly heavier floral note underneath the jasmine that was not the jasmine product I knew. I noticed it the way you notice something familiar that has been fractionally altered, the kind of noticing that does not fully resolve into conscious thought, but sits just below it, a persistent small wrongness. I said nothing. I attributed it to something she had been near at the temple. Incense or flowers used in an offering, something innocuous. 2 weeks later she came home from another temple visit, and the same note was there. I noticed again. I still said nothing. The jasmine explanation felt thinner the second time, but I smoothed it out and moved on. A name began to appear in her conversation in December. Kunvirat. She mentioned him first as a temple volunteer at Wat Suan Dok, someone who helped with the administration of the community outreach program the temple ran for elderly residents. She mentioned him casually, the way you mention someone who occupies a peripheral position in the ordinary texture of your days. He had helped organize a merit-making event that she had participated in. He had recommended a monk whose Dhamma talks were worth attending. He knew the head monk well and had introduced her, which she was grateful for because the introduction had led to a conversation that she found genuinely meaningful. Each of these mentions was innocent. The accumulation of innocent mentions is what is never innocent, and I, who had spent 31 years teaching students to understand what accumulation of detail means in a narrative, continued to read each mention individually rather than as part of a developing pattern. I am including this detail because it is the one that embarrasses me most, professionally. I knew better. I had a specific, trained competence that should have protected me here. It did not, because the thing that prevented me from applying that competence was not stupidity, but the particular blindness of someone who has decided in advance what the story is. By January, I was aware, at a level below full consciousness, that something was wrong. Not specifically wrong in a way I could name, but wrong in the way that a house sometimes feels different when you return to it after a long absence, as though something in the arrangement of things has shifted while you were not looking. She was present when she was with me. She was warm and affectionate, and she still sat with me in the mornings for our meditation practice, 20 minutes of quiet breathing before the day began, which had been our habit since the first year. Nothing about those mornings had changed in its surface texture. But there was something in her, a quality of partial attention, the sense of a mind with one room rented out to something it did not want me to see, that I felt without being able to put my hands on it. I went through her line messages once, in February. She was showering, and her phone was on the kitchen table, and it was not password protected at that point. That came later, and I picked it up and opened line with the specific self-knowledge of a man who is doing something he will regret regardless of what he finds. There were messages from Kunwirat. They were taken individually, not conclusive. Messages about temple events, about a Dhamma book he was recommending, about a date for a community merit-making that she was helping to coordinate. But the frequency of them, the easy back and forth, the particular casualness of two people who are very comfortable with each other, this had a texture that the formal language of temple coordination does not require. I put the phone down before she came out of the shower. I had not found a smoking gun. What I had found was a fire burning steadily behind a closed door, and I chose, once again, not to open the door. She introduced a new pattern in March. She began going to temple early in the morning, before I was fully awake, and returning in time for our meditation sitting. She said the early morning energy at the temple was conducive to a specific quality of practice that the later hours did not have. The monks completing their alms rounds, the compound quiet before the day's visitors arrived, the light at that hour being different in a way that she could not quite describe in English, but that affected the quality of her attention when she sat. I found this beautiful. I found it so beautiful that I encouraged it. I told her I thought it was wonderful that she was deepening her practice. I was, and I use this word with full and uncomfortable awareness, spiritually naive. My faith in the sincerity of her practice was so complete that I made it structurally impossible for myself to question. The alibi the practice was providing. Her phone acquired a lock code in late March. She had never used one before. When I asked about it, she said her friend's phone had been gone through by someone at a shared workspace, and she had become more careful as a result. I accepted this because it was on its own a plausible explanation. I accepted it also because I had made a private commitment sometime in January not to be the kind of partner who examines his partner's technology as though she were a suspect rather than a person he trusted. This commitment, which came from a genuine place and reflected something real about how I wanted to conduct myself, also served the very convenient function of preventing me from doing the thing that would have told me what I needed to know several months earlier. We are very good, all of us, at finding principled justifications for the investigations we are afraid to conduct. There were smaller things in the same period that I cataloged without naming. She began deleting her line message history more frequently, clearing conversations in the way you clear a whiteboard between classes. And I only knew this because I had seen the thread with Virat in February, and its relative brevity by March, given how active it had been, could only be explained by deletion rather than silence. She took phone calls outside the house on 2 occasions in April, stepping onto the small front porch and speaking quietly in Thai, coming back inside and saying it was her sister in Chiang Mai. I did not know her sister's voice. I had met the sister once briefly and had no basis to dispute the identification. I noted it, and I noted that I was noting it, and I continued doing nothing with what I was accumulating. My sleep deteriorated badly through March and April. I was waking at 4 in the morning with a dry mouth and a heartbeat that seemed out of proportion to the hour, lying in the dark beside her, while she slept with the uncomplicated soundness of someone whose conscience was not apparently producing the same nocturnal output as mine. I lost weight without trying, perhaps 4 or 5 pounds across those 2 months, and attributed it to the heat of the season rather than to the sustained, low-grade anxiety that had taken up residence in my chest and was not paying rent. I tried to raise my concerns once, in April, and it went the way these conversations go when one person is managing the other person's perception with real skill. I said, during an evening at home, that I sometimes felt like there was something she was not telling me, and that I wanted her to know she could tell me anything, that whatever it was would be better said than kept. She looked at me with an expression of such genuine seeming openness, and said she was not keeping anything from me, that perhaps I was feeling the uncertainty that sometimes accompanies deeper practice, the way that as your attention sharpens, you become aware of impermanence in ways that can feel unsettling, that this was actually described in the texts as a sign of progress rather than regression. She spoke fluently and with what appeared to be genuine concern for my well-being, and she used the language and the conceptual framework of my own practice against me so precisely that I ended the conversation having been both addressed and deflected without being able to identify the moment it happened. She was, I think, genuinely intelligent. I mean that without sarcasm. Frank DeLuca is an American photographer, retired from a career doing documentary work, who has lived in Chiang Mai for 12 years, and who I had known for 2 of those years through a loose group of Western Buddhist practitioners who met informally on the first Sunday of each month at a cafe near Tha Phai Gate. Frank is a quiet, observant man in his mid-60s who I liked precisely because he did not offer opinions unless they had been specifically requested, and who I trusted because his long experience of the city had given him a kind of patient, unillusioned clarity that I found clarifying to be around. Frank went to Wat Suan Dok on a Tuesday in the first week of May to photograph the white kettas in the late afternoon light. He had been meaning to do it for months. He told me this detail later, unprompted, the way people include irrelevant biographical context when they are telling you something important, because the irrelevant context gives them, and you a moment to breathe before the important thing arrives. He called me that evening. He said he needed to tell me something, and he hoped I would hear it in the spirit he meant it, which was not interference, but friendship. He said he had seen Thanya at Wat Suan Dok that afternoon. He said she had been with a man, Thai, roughly her age, and that they had been sitting together in the garden area of the temple compound in a way that Frank, who was someone who paid close attention to how people occupied space together, did not interpret as friendship. he said. The man had his hand on her arm, and she was leaning slightly toward him in the way you lean toward someone you are at ease with, and that Frank had watched them for perhaps 2 minutes before he was certain enough of what he was looking at to make a decision about what to do with it. He had taken no photographs. He had not approached her. He had gone back to his car and called me. I sat with the phone at my ear for a moment after he finished speaking. The evening birds were loud outside the window. Specific, insistent, completely indifferent to the particular quality of the silence inside the house. I remember thinking, in the first seconds after Frank stopped talking, that the light in the room had not changed at all. The lamp was on. The walls were the same color they had been 5 minutes earlier. The small black lacquerware tray with the gold lotus was on my desk exactly where it had been since I bought it at the Wualai Road Market 2.5 years ago. Everything was identical, and the room had become completely different. I thanked Frank. I told him I would deal with it. He said he was sorry. He meant it. I believe he had spent some part of the afternoon deciding whether to call, and I believe he called because he is a decent man, because he thought that if their position were reversed, he would want to know. I set the phone down on the kitchen table. I did not move for what was probably 10 minutes. I noticed that I was holding my breath, and I let it out, and I sat with the specific unpleasant quality of a suspicion that has been confirmed, which is not relief and is not grief, but is something that sits between them. A heaviness that is also, disturbingly, a kind of clarity. When Thanya came home that evening, she looked exactly as she always looked when she returned from the temple. The specific settled quality. The slight glow of someone who has spent time in a place they find genuinely meaningful. She set down her bag and kissed me on the cheek and asked how my afternoon had been, and I said fine, and I asked how the temple was. And she said, peaceful, as it always was at Suan Dok in the late afternoon. She said this without hesitation. She said it in the voice of someone reporting an experience they had genuinely had. And I looked at her, and I understood that she had been at that temple, and that Frank was right about what he had seen, and that she was now standing in our kitchen telling me about the quality of peace at Wat Suan Dok, as though the afternoon had been exactly what I would have assumed it to be. I said his name, not loudly. I said, "Tell me about Kun Virat." The quality of the pause that followed was extremely informative. It was not the pause of someone reaching for the name of an acquaintance. It was the pause of someone choosing, in a compressed fraction of a second, which version of the story to deploy. She said he was a temple volunteer she had mentioned. I said, "I know who you told me he was. Tell me who he actually is." She said she did not understand what I was asking. I said, "I think you understand exactly what I am asking, and I would appreciate it if you would talk to me honestly." She sat down. That was the first indication that the conversation was going to be different from the April conversation, because in April she had stayed standing and redirected with confident fluency, and sitting down had the quality of a posture change that meant something. She looked at the table for a while. Then she said that Virat was someone she had known before she and I became serious. She said they had grown up in nearby areas, that they had known each other peripherally for years, that when she had begun volunteering at Wat Suan Dok, she had found him there, and that they had reconnected, and that over the past several months the reconnection had become something that was not only friendship. I asked how long. She said since around November of the previous year, 6 months. The temple visits that had increased in frequency beginning in the autumn. The visits I had encouraged, whose increased devotion I had found beautiful, had been, from November onward, at least partially visits to see Virat, the merit-making mornings, the early departures before I was fully awake, the Dhamma book recommendations, and the introduction to the head monk that she had mentioned so naturally in conversation. All of it had two layers: the visible layer that I was permitted to see, and the layer underneath it that I was not. And the visible layer had been made from materials I genuinely revered, so that it would be maximally unlikely that I would look below it. She said she was sorry. She said it was complicated, that Virat and she had a history that predated me, that she had not intended for it to develop the way it had, that she had genuinely tried to stop it and had not been able to. She said she had real feeling for me, that she wanted me to know that. And here is the thing I have sat with most carefully in the months since. I believe she was telling the truth when she said she had real feeling for me. I believe the morning meditations were genuine, that the temple visits we made together were genuine, that her engagement with my practice and her patience with my questions were genuine. I also believe that Virat occupied a part of her life that was older and deeper than anything she and I had built, the kind of connection that forms in a cultural and linguistic register that I, the American Farang, with his translated Pali and his earnest convert's practice, could not access or compete with however much I offered in other ways. I am not saying this excuses what she did. It does not. But I think understanding it matters more to me, in the end, than the blame does. I did not shout. I did not, as I have watched some people do in these situations, become cruel in the specific way that combines maximum honesty with maximum damage. I said I needed her to take her things and go, and I needed some days before I would be ready to talk more. She packed what she needed that evening and called a friend to collect her, and she left with the specific careful quietness of someone who is acutely aware that they have caused damage and is trying not to cause additional damage through the manner of their departure. At the door she turned and said something in Thai that I understood partially, something about hoping I would be all right. I said I would try. She left. I sat in the house for the rest of that evening, and I thought about the photograph Frank had not taken. I thought about the posture he had described, the slight lean, the hand on the arm, and I placed that image alongside the many mornings I had watched her sit in quiet practice in our living room, and I tried to understand how both things could have been simultaneously true about the same person. The Buddhist answer, which I knew well enough to recognize, is that they could be simultaneously true because people are not fixed, coherent, unified selves but rather processes, constantly shifting assemblages of tendencies and conditions and responses, capable of genuine devotion and genuine deception at the same time without one canceling the other. This is, intellectually, a perspective I hold. In practice, sitting in the house where I had spent 2 years 9 months building what I believed was a shared life, the intellectual framework was not particularly helpful. I called my daughter in Seattle the following morning. She is 38, a social worker with 2 children, and a clear-eyed pragmatism that I have always relied on and occasionally resented. I told her what had happened in 3 or 4 sentences. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dad, I know you don't want to hear this, but I was a little worried about the situation from the beginning." I asked her what she meant, and she said she had wondered sometimes whether the spiritual dimension of the relationship had made it harder for me to see it clearly, whether my investment in Buddhism had become, in some way, an investment in Thanya specifically, so that questioning her had felt like questioning the practice. I said that was perceptive and accurate, and I wished she had said it 18 months ago. She said she had not known how, and that I would not have heard it. She was right on both counts. The reconstruction, which I conducted over the following weeks with the obsessive attention of a person who needs to understand exactly where the thing failed, produced a timeline that extended further than November. A friend of Thanya's, a woman named Rachani, who ran a food stall near the Santatham market, and who had always been friendly to me in the way that people are friendly to their friends' partners, confirmed when I spoke to her that Thanya and Virat had been seeing each other intermittently for years, with periods of separation or reconnection that tracked the fluctuations of his circumstances rather than hers. They had been close before I arrived in Chiang Mai. They had been in contact from the beginning of Thanya's relationship with me. The November start date she had given me was the escalation of something that had never fully stopped. I sat with this information for a long time, and I thought about the day I took the 5 precepts at the temple in Sankamphaeng, where the senior monk had known her family for decades, and I wondered if Virat had been in the temple that day, or if she had thought about him, or if the precept about right conduct had landed in her with any weight at all. That last thought was not fair, and I knew it was not fair, and I had it anyway. Thanya moved in with her Virat within a month of leaving the house in Santatham. Rachani told me this without being asked, in the course of a conversation about something else. I thanked her. I bought a bowl of rice from her stall and ate it at the small table outside and watched the market go about its morning business, and I thought, so that part is done. There was no anger in the thought and no grief. Just the flat, specific recognition of a chapter closing and what comes after the closing being something I had not yet looked at clearly enough to describe. I am still in Chiang Mai. This surprises some people who assume that the natural response to this kind of experience in a place is to leave the place. But the place did not deceive me. The temples are still there, Wat Chedi Luang and Wat Piara That Doi Suthep, and the small neighborhood, temples where I have become a familiar face at the morning alms rounds. The practice is still mine. This is the thing I had to work hardest to recover, the certainty that what happened to me did not invalidate the path I came here to walk, that the corruption of the alibi does not corrupt the thing the alibi was borrowing from. A temple is not made dishonest because someone uses it dishonestly. Merit-making is not made hollow because someone makes merit and also deceives. These were the questions I had to sit with after she left, and I am going to be honest that sitting with them was harder than anything else the situation produced, harder than the anger, and harder than the grief. The grief I knew how to hold. The theological questions were more difficult. She has not contacted me since she left. I did not expect her to. The relationship ended cleanly, in the specific way that relationships end when the person leaving has somewhere definite to go and the person staying has nothing further to offer. I am not angry at her, or not primarily. I am angry at specific choices she made, and I am sad about the specific cost of those choices, and I am doing the work, slowly and imperfectly, of separating what I lost from what I still have. What I lost was a relationship and a version of my daily life that I valued. What I still have is the path I came here to walk, the practice, the tradition, the 300-plus temples, and the morning alms rounds, and the particular quality of Chiang Mai light at the hour the monks are out. Those were here before Thanya. They are here now. What I want to say to you, if you are someone who has a partner who's religious or spiritual, practice you deeply respect, whose faith you find meaningful and beautiful, who goes to the temple with a consistency that you have never questioned because you never wanted to question something sacred. I want to say this carefully and with as much specificity as I can manage. Genuine faith and the performance of faith look identical from the outside. A person can hold real spiritual devotion and real dishonesty simultaneously, and one does not automatically contaminate the other. The question is not whether her practice is genuine. The question is whether the pattern of her observance is consistent with what it would need to be if the observance were only observance. Ask yourself, does the frequency of the temple visits track with the religious calendar, or does it track with something else? Does she always go to the same temple, or does she rotate through locations that are harder for you to verify? When she comes back, does the settled quality she carries look the same as it looks after the visits you make together? Or is there a different texture to it, a quality that your body recognizes before your mind does? These are not suspicious questions. They are the questions you would ask about any account of anyone's time that you had a reason to examine. Faith does not make time unaccountable. Faith is not a privacy zone that love cannot enter. The second thing I want to say is about the danger of building your own identity around another person's practice. My conversion was real. My commitment to this tradition was and is genuine. But in retrospect, the two things, my practice and my relationship with Thanya, had become so entangled in my own understanding of my life that examining one felt like threatening the other. This entanglement was a structural vulnerability. If your spiritual path and your romantic relationship are the same object in your mind, then any threat to the relationship feels like a threat to something sacred, and you will avoid examining the relationship with the clarity it deserves because the examination feels like sacrilege. Keep them separate. Love the person and love the practice as two distinct things that happen to coexist in your life. Do not let them merge into one, because when one proves complicated, you need the other to be stable. I needed my practice after she left. I am grateful, more grateful than I can adequately express, that I had enough of it that was genuinely mine and not dependent on her presence to draw from in those weeks. The third thing I want to say is about what spiritual language can do in the hands of someone who knows it well. When Thanya redirected my concern in April by framing my unease as a feature of deepening practice rather than an appropriate response to a real situation, she was using language I respected and trusted to close off an avenue of investigation. I knew the conceptual framework she was deploying. I found it credible because I had found it credible in other contexts. The lesson here is not that the framework is wrong. The lesson is that any framework of understanding, including a genuine and useful one, can be used as a deflection mechanism, and the test of whether it is being used to illuminate or to obscure is whether the conversation it produces leads you toward clarity or away from it. In April, the conversation led me away from clarity. A genuine response to a partner's concern about disconnection does not use a shared tradition against the person raising the concern. It addresses the concern directly. The fourth thing I want to say is the most uncomfortable, and it is this: the fact that someone loves you and the fact that someone is deceiving you are not mutually exclusive. I have resisted this understanding because it is easier to believe that the love was false from the beginning, that I was simply played from the start by someone with no genuine feeling. That version lets me draw a clean line and put everything on one side of it. The messier truth, which I believe is closer to accurate, is that Thanya had genuine affection for me and genuine connection to Virat, and she handled the conflict between those two things by concealment rather than by the harder path of honesty. She is not a monster. She is a person who made a specific set of choices, and those choices hurt me, and I think she probably knew, on some level, for a long time that they would. That she delayed that hurt as long as she could is not generosity. But it is human, in a way that I understand even while I am still working through my own accounting with it. If the person you are with takes the temple or the mosque or the church as their alibi, and you find yourself extending unlimited trust because you do not want to be the kind of person who questions sacred practice, question it anyway. Not harshly, not with accusation, but with the same clear eyes you would bring to any account of time that did not quite add up. The sacred deserves your respect. It does not automatically deserve your credulity on behalf of someone else's claimed participation in it. There is a difference, and it matters. I go to Wat Suan Dok sometimes. I sat there the first time a few weeks after she left, in the afternoon, in the garden area, near the white shetties where Frank had stood with his camera, not quite pointing, at two people sitting in the way that people sit when they are at ease with each other in a way they should not be. The light was what it always is at that hour. The incense was what it always is. I sat for a while with the specific discomfort of being in a place that has two different meanings now, the meaning it had before Frank called and the meaning it acquired after, and I let both meanings be present without trying to resolve them into one. That is the practice, as best as I understand it. Not the elimination of difficulty, but the willingness to sit with it, without adding the suffering of wishing it were otherwise. I am not there yet, entirely. But I sat in that garden, and I breathed, and I listened to the birds and the distant traffic and the particular quality of silence that a temple compound holds even in the middle of a city. And I thought, the place is still true. Whatever happened here, the place is still true. And I am still the person who came across the world to sit in places like this one, and that person did not disappear when Thanya left. He is still here, considerably more clear-eyed than he was, considerably less certain about some things he was previously certain about, and still, on the whole, glad to be in this city, in this light, trying to pay attention to what is actually here rather than the story he is telling about it. After 30 years of teaching other people to read difficult text honestly, I am trying, at last, to read my own.